The program in visual impairments, comic studies in the Longmore Institute on Disability, presents Adapting Comics for Blind and Low Vision Readers. A roundtable discussion. Join a panel of experts in access, blindness, and comics as we explore creative and technological approaches to open up this historically visual medium to blind and low vision readers. Tuesday, March 23rd, 5 to 6:30 p.m. PT. Panelists: Chancey Darren DeFrain, Skye McCloud, Josh Mealy, Aaron Rodriguez. SFSU hosts: Emily Beitiks, Yue-Ting, Nick Sousanis. Register at tinyurl.com/accesscomics. Audio description of all materials provided. For ASL and CART, request by Friday, March 19th at 12 p.m. to BEITIKS@sfsu.edu.
So welcome and thank you all for joining us. And when I say all, I really mean all. I'm so astounded at how many people showed up, and we're excited to be here. And I have to say that just as a note, I have to say who I am too. I'm Nick Sousanis. I'm a white male with glasses, and I'm wearing a collared shirt with a Batman t-shirt below it, and I'm in a white room. And I run the comic studies program here, and I'm going to say a few words to start. My colleagues are going to say some words right after, and then I'm going to introduce how we got to this point. And I have to say at the start that we conceived this as a small working group to get us to learn more about what was out there. And then about a week and a half ago, we thought, well, maybe we'll make it more public and see if we can cast a little broader net and find a few more people who, learn some things that we don't know. And when we did that, we were just sort of overwhelmed with how much it exploded and how much interest there is, which is really exciting. And we realized this is a Zoom session with a few hundred people on it and a few hundred more who've registered. So we won't be able to address everything clearly. And we acknowledge that there are going to be people in the Zoom room that have worked a lot in this space. And, hopefully we'll be able to interact with you. If not tonight, we're going to share the video link afterward. We're going to share all the resources that we collect from tonight that you put through the questions and answers. So please share whatever you're working on, and we will just try to continue this conversation, today, but going forward, because it's really generated a lot of interest, and we're really excited to be here. So thank you all for joining, and I'm going to hand this over to Emily and Ting, and I'll be back in a second.
This is Emily Beitiks. I'm the Associate Director at the Longmore Institute on Disability at San Francisco State. And we are so very happy to be hosting this program today. We have all of our work has been about studying and showcasing disability experiences and stories and using those to revolutionize social views around disability. And we have in all of our programs, from the film festival we run to the exhibit that we built, been thinking about how do we build access that goes beyond compliance and is creative and artful. And there's a really good challenge here in comics, and we're very excited to be learning with you all today and supporting this event. Chat has been turned off for access. So if you need any tech support, or if you just want to join the conversation, please use the Q&A box to do so. Thank you all. And I'll pass it to Ting.
Hi everyone, Ting here. I'm of Asian descent, wearing a bright yellow sweater, and behind me, it's just a virtual background of the Golden Gate Bridge. So no $1 million view from the hills for me. It's all the virtual background. So I am an assistant professor, and I coordinate the program in visual impairments at San Francisco State. Basically what that means is I train teachers to work with blind and low vision students. You might hear the acronym Teacher of the Visually Impaired, or TVI. That's me, and that's the type of teachers that I train. I came into this space because Nick and I were hired as new faculty at the same time. And as a teacher of the visually impaired, or TVI, I'm always really interested in creative ways for facilitating multimedia access and just information accessibility for my students, but also my friends who happen to be blind or visually impaired. So Nick and I got to talking, and our just creative outlets started sparking. And I'm really happy that now 5 years later, we had this opportunity to formalize the conversation a little bit and invite a conversation with the real experts who are out there. One thing I really appreciate about this event is that we have representation from both comic makers, but also people from the blindness community. I identify as an ally and activist in the disability community, so I think it's really important to be designing with and alongside people that you want to benefit with accessible information. So thanks everybody for coming here. I will be helping with moderation today, but really my role here is just to facilitate the broader conversation because we want to hear from all of you. I put in the chat for people who want to spark a conversation in social media, we're using the hashtag comics A11Y. And A11Y is a numeronym that stands for accessibility. So that's our hashtag for today. And Nick is going to take us through a little intro with slides. As he works through the slides, I'll be providing image description for all of the image content per slide. And some of you might look at the slide and think, oh, I would have described that in a different way. And that's totally fine because description is in itself an art and can be subjective. So if it prompts you to start getting creative or thinking about how you would describe it, or just at least note how I'm describing it differently than if the creator of the image were to describe it. That's where some creative license can be taken with descriptions, so bear with me and don't judge me too harshly. And with that, I guess what Nick has got on his screen now, this is just our event flyer. And the credit for this comic that's on our event flyer goes to Nick for creating a comic for our event, so very meta. It's a series of black ink panels that show an eyeball, hands reading Braille, and a figure holding a white cane. And above these images, there are speech bubbles that ask, how can a visual medium be made accessible? And then there are additional panels that show an ear, various tactile textures, and a vibrating smartphone with an additional question, what new possibilities emerge? And I think that helps to set the tone. So off to you, Nick.
Thank you so much, Ting and Emily. So I'll say, I run the comic studies program at our university, and we have a minor, which we've graduated quite a few students in the 4 years since we've had the minor and the 5 years since I've been here. And I wanted to say a tiny bit about myself, though, to introduce this. I did this work unflat. Oh, Ting, you describe it first. Sorry.
Oh, sure. So on the left side of the screen is a book cover. And to me, it looks like from a bird's eye view, a stream of liquid as it pours down and then disperses like a system of roots. And on the right side of the slide, there is a sketch of two eyes closed with text, in seeking new approaches for opening expansive spaces and awakening possibilities. And then there's another sketch with the eyes open now. Let us look to our ways of seeing ourselves and how quite literally the means to create perspective lies right between our eyes. The distance separating our eyes means that there is a difference between the view each produces. Thus, there is no single correct view.
Thanks, Ting. So I did this work on flattening, which was originally my dissertation, which is probably the first that was done entirely in comic book form. And the goal with that was to make the ideas of scholarship accessible to a broader audience. And the goal of our program has been to make education a more accessible means. But I realized both while working on my work and in the classes that I teach about comics and visual communication, that while I think it's true they bring access to a lot of information in different ways that wouldn't be possible without them, there's obviously an audience that gets excluded, and maybe more excluded than they would be otherwise. So it's sort of been on my mind, and the reason that the website exists, or the reason that place on the website exists, is I've been, as I've encountered new ideas, I've sort of dropped them into the site. And then when I met Ting, I got a little more excited about it, and I've had her as a guest at my class. And this fall we had a meeting, because I have some graduate students who are going to do their thesis as comics. and we had a meeting about accessibility. And the solution at this point for them was, pretty simple. They can write a short text description summary. But I thought rather than seeing it as sort of a hardship, it might be an opportunity for us to do something. And it might be an opportunity for us to explore this space with the students and with collaborations around our campus and collaborations abroad or beyond. And so sort of hatched that idea, and we were able to get an internal grant to have this conversation. And so we pitched this as sort of the kickoff to survey the little bit that we know that's out there, and to find out what we don't know, and to find out from some experts, what do these things work, what's cool to me as a sighted person, like, ooh, that's really neat, might be totally not useful to somebody who's using it in the way it's intended. So our goal with this was to sort of go through a few examples, talk to our panel of experts, and then start to learn more. And the fact that you're all here means we have an opportunity to learn even more and hopefully grow even more connection. So our first step is just to very quickly take you through a few examples that I actually haven't touched any of these, so I can't say more about them than I've seen, but just to get you a sense of what we've encountered and then go from there. So this is a slide that says a few examples we've come across from tactile audio and now go ahead, team.
Hey, so in here we have a large graphic. It shows several varying size panels in grayscale, and each panel shows what looks like a quilted pattern of different patterns.
Great, and so this is Ilan Manouk's shape reader, and this got a lot of attention 4 or 5 years ago. And he describes it as a community-specific tactile con language, constructed language, and it's these abstract tiles that he tells a story with, and it's its own language, and he's worked with blind communities in workshopping it and creating new stories with it, and so we wanted to share this as one of the examples that we've heard of. Can I go to the next? If you want to, and this is another one. This is by the, oh, sorry, Ting.
Oh, it's okay. On this slide, we have a tactile map that shows land on either side of a waterway. So there's a bunch of X's that mark a series of circles that connect in a path from a shoreline out to sea. And then there's an inset graphic that shows a boat traveling along the waterway.
Thank you. And this is by the Spanish artist Max. It's called A Boat Tour. And it's described as a tactile comic for navigating Venice. And it's made in collaboration with blind and visually impaired as part of the Blind Wiki app, and I think as part of the Venice Biennale. And I think Ting described it pretty well. So I'll move on.
Great. And on this next slide, we have a person's holding their thumb against a page of a comic book that shows white braille dots against a black background.
Yes, and this is by two Mexican artists, and this is called Census El Universo and Sus Ojos. It's a braille comic, and on the left page, the left facing page is a description of the various images, and on the right side there's braille that relays the text. As far as I'm aware of, this was the first Mexican braille comic. And again, all of these things are posted links on my site that we shared at the resources. Go to the next one.
Great, and here we have a close-up page of a tactile and braille book that shows Donald Duck grumbling to himself. And the picture is also done as a raised graphic.
And this is from the Dutch company Dedicand, which they specialize in doing alt reading formats for blind readers. That's about all I know about it, but their website shows a number of these things that they've created for blind and visually impaired readers. Go to the next.
Okay, and this is a CAD rendering of a page from a comic with several panels that are depicted in relief, or like 2.5D.
Right, and this is a very recent, this just was kickstarted at the end of last year. This is Einar Peterson's Brachen Implant. And it sort of looks like traditional comic book drawings and panels, but it's in this extruded 3D model, 3D tactile form. And I understand from the Kickstarter site that the words will be also printed in Braille. It's not evident in this slide, but that's what they describe.
Okay, and next up, there's a multicolor, a multi-panel comic titled Vizzling, and it generally includes two characters having a discussion. So some of the panels include a bunch of text, while other panels show how a comic would appear on a tablet.
Yeah, and so this is Darren, DeFrain, and Aaron Rodriguez, their app Vizzling, and they're on the panel, so they're going to describe this at more length, but it's a haptic comic app for visually impaired readers.
Okay, and here there's a black and white comic that shows several people wearing head coverings surrounding a patient lying on a bed. There's some animation to the graphic so that each panel and speech box is numbered in the numerical sequence as it appears spatially in the comic.
And this is Daniel Fontaine, who's also on the panel. This is his audio adaptation of Lissa, which is a graphic novel billed as an ethnographic graphic novel that came out about 3 or 4 years ago, I believe. And we'll hear more from Daniel in a little bit.
Okay, and this is a very vibrant colored image. It's a computer-generated graphic of a person with a long side swoop of black hair and angular features. And this person is centered on a vibrant red background.
And this is Chad Allen's Unseen, an audio comic. This is, as it's described, it's written by a blind person with a blind heroine for blind and sighted audiences. And it's an audio comic as it describes it. And there are some sound effects that sort of describe the moving from panel to panel and the turning of the pages that go throughout the narrative.
And here it shows Braille instructions for Lego sets. From the first step, it's an image of instructions on a computer screen. It looks like it can be downloaded. And then it says the next step is have a sighted friend help sort the pieces, and a little drawing of little Lego pieces in various boxes are shown. And then the third step says build the set. And it's just a photo of a Lego constructed building.
Yeah, and this is from Matthew Schiffrin. This is his project Lego for the Blind, and we're gonna have two things from Matthew to end our slide set here. But he's created a system to help blind Lego users build Legos, and his instructions are on the website legofortheblind.com. And his TED Talk is on YouTube, which is also linked on my site. It's really a profound, I think, argument for these being created. So here's the final thing.
Okay, on the left side of the image, there's a computer-generated image of a person wearing a head-circling headgear, and it's labeled as a vestibular fooling sensation device. And on the side of the headgear, there's two circles that are drawn. And that's labeled with text, opposing flywheels impart accelerations on the head. And then along the right side of the graphic, it's just an anatomical image depicting the anatomy of the ear.
Yeah, and so this is also from Matthew Schiffrin. This is his project Daredevil with MIT. And I think the sort of rundown of the projects we've seen some tactile, we've seen haptic, we've seen audio. And this one I think is trying to go even farther from adapting and translating into creating an entirely new form of media. So it's described as I'm just reading what I read about it, the immersive virtual reality to feel like a superhero while listening to 3D sound audio comic. So we wanted to give you just a little rundown of some of the things that we had come across, things that maybe our students will think about, maybe, that we'll expand, maybe we'll find that some of these are really appropriate for the kind of work we want to see going forward. And maybe some of them, as our experts will say, maybe there's some things we don't know about them that maybe suggest they're not the right ways to go. But we're really excited to have gathered this, and we want to turn it over to our panelists now, correct?
Okay, great. Thanks for that quick tour of things. And, we certainly recognize that this is not an all-encompassing comprehensive tour, but it's really just to whet the appetites for more. and just to open the door to conversation. So thank you to everybody who's plopping links and ideas and resources into our Q&A chat box. Everything will be collected into an event resource document, just so people know. And it will be posted when everything's been made accessible. And because you registered, everybody will get a link to this event recording and to the resources in the Q&A. So please, as the panel discussion goes on, this really is a roundtable discussion. Feel free to share your ideas and links to other resources in the chat. All right, so the first question, this one is for Josh Mealy, Chancey Fleet, and Skye McCloud. A common pitfall is that designers can start designing to provide access to blind people without actually grounding their efforts in blind expertise. So what do you guys think people need to understand about non-visual ways of engagement and blind identity so that accessible products will actually appeal to blind readers?
Did you have somebody you wanted to go first, Ting?
Go for it, Josh.
Okay. Hey, I think I've been asked to introduce myself as a starter to this. So my name is Josh Mealy. I'm a scientist who's spent a lot of time doing accessibility research in the, particularly in the blind and low vision space, but also in general to look at universal design for learning. And I've done a lot of work in the area of accessible information, video description, and wayfinding and stuff like that. So so that's why I'm here. I've been I'm hopefully here for my accessibility expertise, not my comics expertise, because this is a fairly new area to me, although I've been having comics described to me my whole life. I've also been asked to give you a visual description of myself, which is really hilarious. This is the first time I've ever, as a blind person, been in the position of describing myself. Usually blind people don't really, or a lot of us don't really care that much, but I am a white, one-eyed, burned blind guy with curly, dark hair. I'm wearing a shirt that marks me as a square professional, and I'm sitting in a cluttered office. So to answer your question, Ting, I think that one of the things that we really need to think about, and I'd like to, I think I'll probably be expanding on this as we go forward, but information, just like in HTML, how we sort of try to separate out the information from the presentation. That's why we use style sheets. That's why we try to, sort of, keep the information separate from the presentation to clarify how we offer stuff. I think that the most important thing in comics is to really think about what the information is, and then to think about different ways that we can present it. So I am really excited. I've learned quite a bit about various experiments that have been tried, and I'm excited to learn more about those experiments. But the thing to remember about them is that they are all experiments, and in order to have experiments be valuable, they need to provide data. So not only do we need to come up with cool new ways of categorizing and presenting information from comics so that it can be accessible for not just blind and visually impaired people, but there may be lots of uses for this information in the long run that comes from abstracting it away from the visual. But we also need to think about how we present it and like what sorts of structures we use to maintain it. And then, so the designers, I think the designers have a number of challenges. We need to think about what types of information needs to be collected and stored, And then what are the means of what are the effective means of repeating that back to people? So we need to experiment with those techniques, and we need to look at how people feel about those techniques and how good people are at understanding them, and how much people like it, because ultimately comics and any medium that is for information transmission and also enjoyment, accessibility is not just about getting at the information. Accessibility is about creating a similar experience to what the original intent offered. And if we don't offer a parallel or similar experience that offers the pleasure and enjoyment and information transmission that was in the original, we've failed in our accessibility goals. I've got so much more to say, but I'll just stop because Chancey's got great things to say also, and we've only got a limited amount of time. So thank you.
Thank you, Josh, for starting off that conversation. So maybe we'll hand it off to Chancey Fleet, who's coming to us from the New York Public Library. Chancey is the Assistive Technology Coordinator there. Chancey, off to you. What do you think people need to understand about non-visual ways of engagement and blind identity so that accessible products will appeal to blind readers?
Hi, everybody. So I'm in Brooklyn. I identify as blind. If you look at my eyes, you'll see that they just do whatever they want to do. That's part of my visual description. And I'm wearing a defiantly comfortable call center looking headset and a purple shirt with pink flowers on it. And I have like a patterned leaf wallpaper tapestry thing behind me. With that out of the way, so I'm at the New York Public Library, and part of my job there is to curate accessible technology in the branch, and part of my job there is to work with library patrons from all walks of life who are blind or visually impaired and help them meet their technology goals. And being in a library, I love it because every goal is valid and the exploration of every medium is valid. And I just have always loved pushing the boundaries of what's possible when it comes to accessibility. And in the past couple years, I founded and I run a little lab called the Dimensions Project at the library, where we have the means of production for tactile graphics. We have embossers and swell form machines and 3D printers, and we're able to invite people who are blind or sighted to come in and create 3D models and tactile representations at will. And the fun thing has been seeing the types of things that blind and sighted people want to create, and how sometimes what sighted people think is going to be important diverges from what blind people enjoy and pursue, and how sometimes there is a confluence and sighted people bring to our attention something that is very interesting. Some of the images that have been the most effective for me and for a lot of the people in the community I serve are sort of basic images. As a rule, with tactile representation, we want things to be uncluttered. We want them to be well and concisely labeled. We want them to be scaled up because that is the nature of tactile acuity and perception. And so some of the most useful things we have access to are things like maps and graphs. However, there's a lot of art that lends itself fairly well and readily to a tactile form. And I think about Keith Haring when I say this a lot. I've looked at a lot of Keith Haring pieces now, and I feel like I understand them, and I understand kind of the kinetics and movement in them and the relationships in them. And that can happen without a whole lot of transliteration, although there's some rescaling and there's some kind of decoloring, right? And another example, there's a Ram 2, a graffiti artist in the South Bronx. He's losing his vision over time. His name is Tony Cruz, and Ram 2 is his tag though. And he came in as he's losing his vision and started doing graffiti with the swell form machine and handing out graffiti to a workshop of folks that he was teaching at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And I learned that, at least for me, graffiti in its boldness, in its use of abstracted kind of iconic shapes, in its large scale and limited use of text, really readied itself for tactile exploration. And a graffiti mural is not a comic, but it shares some of that boldness and some of that resort to iconic figures. And so first of all, there are so many different types of blind people with different reference points. Did we lose our vision later in life? Have we been proudly identifying as blind from birth? What visual reference, cultural reference do we have? Do we have tactile acuity? Do we want to experience things in a tactile way, or are we more comfortable using audio? We're a very diverse community. And so I guess I would encourage folks to always engage with a whole bunch of us and make sure that you're not just speaking to one or two representatives that may be giving you a very selective little window into the community, that you lean into exploring stylistic variation and what kinds of styles, whether they're audio or haptic or tactile or something else, work well for folks, that you lean into the reality that we think of comics as a visual or spatial medium, but we might want to work with multiple modalities, but we just don't want to use description and then we've got some kind of a screenplay, right? We want to creatively use multiple modalities to bring comics to life. And I think in addition to looking at the information that comics present, we may want to look at what we can do to preserve the unique aspects of experiencing the medium of comics. So from the little that I've written in the last, or read in the last few weeks, I've dived into a couple comics and a couple comics about comics. And so I'm thinking a lot about how a comic is the juxtaposition of language and image. What can we do with describing an image that makes it still a meaningful juxtaposition between a language element and an image? I think the iconic and sort of abstracted and scaled up images that work really well for tactile graphics also can be found in comics a lot, and that's maybe a confluence that we can use to our advantage. And I think it's important to preserve the space between the panels, the gutter, if you will, the opportunity for the reader's imagination to fill in the gaps between moments in the action or between panels. How can we preserve that even if we are creating an audio drama, or even if we are creating a hybrid of something that's tactile and haptic or audio? I think the sky's the limit. There hasn't been a ton of work done in this space, although we've seen some slides of 5 or 6 great projects. I think there's so much opportunity for innovation, and almost anything goes as long as it goes hand in hand with the community advising and iterating and reacting at every step of the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Chancey. And Skye is our resident filmmaker in the space. And Skye, I invite you to give more of an introduction. And if you would like to answer the question of what you think people need to understand about non-visual ways of engagement.
Yeah, is my microphone working?
Yes, you sound good.
Okay, great. Hi, my name is Skye McCloud. Yeah, I am a filmmaker, also blind, and I host a podcast about blind representation in media called Citizen White-Cane, as well as a friend who's also blind. I think that it's really important, I think, to include us and have blind people be kind of at the I guess, forefront or leading the way in these things. But I do think there also is a lot of need for there to be kind of more of a push in the able community to have, like, to make it a priority. But I do think that it's interesting. I was thinking about how a lot of comics are not necessarily at all accessible to blind people. So there's kind of like this dual thing of wanting the kind of audiobooks to be able to access more and more of the media that exists. But at the same time, I'm a big proponent for having blind creators and using different mediums to represent the blind experience. I think there's been recently a lot more attention to the need for audio descriptions in media, and that's still a big issue. that a lot of content, like even doing a podcast, a lot of times we watch things about blind people and there's no audio description. So I think that there's like so much work that needs to be done to make what does exist accessible to us. But I also think that we need more creators that are disabled to use these mediums in the creative ways like we saw at the beginning of that, or at this in that slideshow. There's so many cool things that can be done to kind of form breaking ways of making comics and other like visual media kind of from a blind lens. And that's something that I'm really excited about in the filmmaking I do. I think another thing I'm thinking about is that like 90% of blind people have some vision. And so finding that way to kind of balance the, like when talking about comics, it is entirely visual medium, but balancing the kind of the visuals that do exist with audio formats and how you can use some of the vision you have. And I think, but still making it totally accessible to people without vision. And that's kind of an interesting creative challenge. So yeah, those are some thoughts to answer the question.
Thank you so much, Skye.
Ting, can I come back in? I just wanted to clarify something that I said. Is that okay?
Sure, go for it.
Yeah, so this is Josh Mealy again. And I realized that I started us off in sort of maybe in the middle of a thought, and I apologize for that. But what Skye and Chancey have both been talking about is really so important, that everybody needs something different out of these comics. And my comments about sort of presentation and content were really geared around exactly that. So we don't know, like each person needs something different, and we're not going to create a one size fits all answer for this. In fact, no description, video description or image description really works as a one size fits all. So my hope is that we can find a method where we can store lots of information about every panel, and then find the right way to present the information that's needed for each individual person. For a person who has some vision, that may just be finding out a little more about one person's attire in a frame, or reading the text. Or for a completely blind person, that might mean that there's a whole automated set of, it knows, the system knows what information you need. But ultimately, I want the thing that we come up with to be interactive. I don't think that there's any static. I don't think that a static answer to this or a one size fits all answer to this will meet our ultimate needs. So I apologize for my sort of vagueness earlier, but I wanted to help. I wanted to make it a little more solid based on the appropriate examples that Skye and Chancey brought up. Thank you for letting me.
Oh, of course. And thanks for looping back on that, Josh. And, and I like, Josh, how you brought it back around to there's no one size fits all. I know that some of you are familiar with the more audio formats or description or narrated formats. For anybody new to audio description, you can actually explore some of these on Netflix or some Hulu content. Usually if you go to the captioning menu, the captions menu, if it's available, you'll see an option for audio descriptions. So for anybody who wants to try it out, that's there. But when it comes to using description for comics, I know there was a question in the chat about, and I'm going to paraphrase a little bit here, how we might be replicating ocular centrism in over-exhaustive description practices. So there's the common wisdom that context matters, but what information really matters, and who decides what information matters? So are there any panelists who want to answer that question? Anybody who's involved in description, whether from authoring or enjoying?
This is
yeah, no, sorry, you go first.
Sorry, I'll give a super quick answer. So this is Chancey, and I don't have a super great answer, but to engage with the comics of my choice, getting prepared for this, I worked with a visual interpreter. So that's me connecting to someone who's looking through, in this case, TeamViewer on my computer, and describing panels to me, and then taking questions and taking feedback about more or less or different description. And that's been really great and freeing and instructive for me, because if I were to approach comics from the vantage of the 5 or 6 accessible comics projects, again, that's a very narrow window to peer through on the field. So I think to get the best answers from communities of blind and visually impaired people, it's necessary to first position us to be able to explore the field at will and kind of self-select interest and get interactive description, so we can figure out what we care about and what we like, because the subjects that we want to focus on may not be the subjects that are already sort of ready-made to be accessible in the field. And I'll just drop one other thing into the dialogue before I turn my mic back off, and that is I've been reading the audio production of Sandman, the Audible comic, and I noticed that there are 2 or 3 sentence descriptions of characters. They are unapologetically visual in nature, and they are evocative. They're delivered briefly by a neutral narrator, or sometimes by the primary character who's speaking and who's perceiving the person. And then they just kind of fade into the background and the action happens. And I'm sure that that's not an elegant, that's not an appropriate level of description for every comic in every situation, but it does a lot of heavy lifting and character building, and it's fairly elegant without bogging the story down. And so I wanted to flag that as a form of descriptive comics that seems to be working for a lot of sighted people. And when I tried it, it worked well for me as well.
Yeah, I really love that question also, because I think sometimes I've noticed that people can in like audio descriptions for like visual medium, that sometimes they can get a little overzealous in describing and really focusing too much on visual things that blind people don't, or most of us are not super focused on or don't mean as much to us. So I think definitely talking to us about what matters. Also, I think I love that in TV and movies, you have such a limited space in between when people are talking. And so like there's such a compression of what's important. And I don't think that's always like going to be helpful, like applicable in all settings, because sometimes they don't have time to give a lot of context. But I do think it creates some creative solutions for quickly giving information without focusing way too much on the kinds of things that, you know, we couldn't care less about, basically.
I think this, you know, again, not to beat a dead horse, but one size won't fit all. Sometimes you'll want to know about the very specific visual aspects of the way something is drawn. I might want to know, you know, what are the colors that are being used in the speech balloons, so I get, you know, so I know not only, you know, so I know what the you know, what the artist was doing to communicate something. But other times I might want to know only what the emotional content is. So I might want that abstracted away, interpreted for me. And really, it's not just who's asking; it's when you're asking and what you want to know at various times. So, and I think that we can't get away, and we shouldn't try to think that comics are not a visual medium. Comics are they are born into a very visual medium, and that's okay. That's what they are. I mean, it would be trying to, you know, it's like saying, you know, a symphony is audio-centric, and it is, but it doesn't mean that we can't describe it or create information about it that helps people who won't be hearing it understand more about it. So so there is a visual centrism to comics, but that doesn't mean that they can't communicate beyond the purely visual medium. I think the really important thing is to make sure that if you don't care about the brush strokes, and if you don't care about the fonts, there are other ways to consume this. So just again, the choice should be by the reader, by the viewer, by the listener, not by the person creating the description.
Great. I think this provides a nice segue point to a comment from one of the participants, Joel Snyder. Joel, I'm so glad you could make it, and it's so great to have a comment from you. So far we've really considered comics as a visual medium, something for visual consumers, and how do we adapt this visual medium into non-visual formats? And Joel Snyder shares a comment that audio description actually has its roots in comics. So Joel says that radio reading service have been voicing newspapers for decades. And indeed, Joel worked as a volunteer reader at the Washington Ear from 1972 and into the 80s. So how does one share the Washington Post on Sunday orally without describing the images? But techniques for doing so most effectively weren't even considered until the early 80s. Joel also shares that Fiorello LaGuardia, the mayor of New York City in the 40s, voiced and described the comics on WNYC every Sunday morning because there had been a newspaper strike, and LaGuardia knew that he could make political hay by going on the radio and conveying the comics to folks who could only listen to the comics. Thanks so much for that little bit of history, Joel. And I think this is also something to remember as people are thinking about accessible comics, is it doesn't have to be something difficult or challenging or this of epic proportions that's something that's only quote unquote for the blind. But in essence, it could be something that makes the medium more universally accessible. And so I'd like to segue us to a more kind of conceptual idea of what is a comic and what makes a comic a comic. And Scott, I hope this makes your ears perk up, because this next question is for you, of course. So Scott, in your book, Understanding Comics, which I've really been enjoying, and I just giggled at so many points of reading the book. Comics are defined as juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence intended to convey information and or to produce an aesthetic response in the viewer. I find it very interesting that you follow this definition by saying that it deliberately excludes genre, subject matter, style, the printing process, and production materials or tools. So with those exclusions in mind, from your perspective, what makes a comic, and what opportunities are there for non-visual formats?
Well, thanks, Ting and Nick and Emily. Yeah, this is such an important question, and actually still hanging out there is to what degree are comics essentially visual? And I'm in some ways the poster boy for that. I'm the original sin of having defined comics in a very visual way. But as you were rereading that old definition, which is the long definition, by the way, I don't suggest people use that all the time in casual speech. It's funny because it doesn't necessarily limit it to that. When you're juxtaposing, I mean, yes, you're juxtaposing images, but juxtaposition is spatial. Oh, and I should say, since we were introducing ourselves, I'm a middle-aged white guy with round glasses and a check shirt, sitting in a cluttered studio with an obsessively upright series of books on my bookshelf. Yeah, it's this idea of putting pictures in sequence. The funny thing is that as I studied comics over the years, I was beginning increasingly to think that space was perhaps the most important aspect of comics, was that the idea that you were mapping time spatially. And in some ways that doesn't have to be visual. When we were talking about the notion of tactile comics, of creating something that you can feel, where you can move through space in a tactile way, that can create a very similar experience. But then that brings up the question of, are we trying to convert the form of comics or the content of comics? And they're so very, very different. And that relates, I think, to what Josh was saying, and Chancey as well, was the idea that there's no one size fits all solution. And in fact, like Skye was saying, oh, and I'm Skye's dad, by the way. I spell my name differently, but that's just so people can pronounce it. We don't want to embrace just one solution, because there really are a variety of different needs that people have, based on whether they're trying to access the form of the content, and also whether they're low vision or no vision, or something in between. And even low vision readers may experience vision very differently, whether it's macular degeneration, glaucoma, or something like that. So I'm really interested in something that Joshua said about the notion of rich meta content, trying to, as much as possible, to having a rich reservoir of information about each and every panel. If you have something that begins as comics, then the notion of having a lot of information that can then be mined in different ways by different people, by different formats. If you've invested a lot of meta information in each panel, then a reader could at least conceivably say, you know what, I'm interested in this, this, and this about this story, but maybe not so much that. Maybe you can leave off what color things are. Maybe I don't care that much, but I want to hear the dialogue. I want to experience, the physical environment, that kind of thing. I'm also fascinated by a lot of what I've heard. I'm fascinated by the combination of haptics and sound, something that, in terms of translating the content, I think that a sound environment can be very important, not merely using sound to convey language, but using sound to create a sense of space. And that in combination with haptics, with some sense of touch, could just be absolutely fascinating. When a part, we use quite a lot of our brain to represent sight. If those brain cells are freed up to other purposes, either because you were born without sight or you lose your sight at some time in your life, then you do have the ability to create much of the same sensation through other means, through tactile means. Let's see here. I'm sorry, I just took a bunch of notes. I was gonna mention that LaGuardia, I was on Stud Circle's show in Chicago, and all those years later, he still remembered Mayor LaGuardia reading comic strips for audiences. It was such a rich experience for him as a kid, and what was it? This was maybe Ira Glass who said they thought that radio was one of the most visual media, and we are in a golden age of audio. So, oh my gosh, there's so much to. Yeah, I'm sorry. There've been so many wonderful ideas shared already, and I think I better stop ranting, except to ask one very important question, which is, maybe we should repeat the question just in case nothing I said in any way answered the question just now. What was the exact question?
What opportunities are there for non-visual formats? Kind of relating back to what makes a comic a comic.
Yeah. I do think that there are some places in which there's a clear separation. And the biggest one is form and content. When Nick was speaking of trying to create tactile comics like the Shape Reader, for example, that format, it's so clearly different in strategy and form and effect and experience from what someone would get out of, say, the audio Sandman, right? They're two vastly different things. The funny thing is that even though I care deeply about the form of comics, I'm actually very form agnostic, in the sense that I feel like questions of form are fascinating, but in the end, it still comes down to what the reader needs, what the reader wants out of a work. And I do hope very much that a lot of these inquiries follow the reader's needs, what the reader finds interesting. And very often the reader really just wants to experience the story in as much detail and richness as readers of the original work did. And at a certain point, it may slide into another form entirely and no longer have anything in common with comics as a form, but it'll still have the shape of the story. And that's okay. You know, it's okay. If it's not comics anymore, fine, whatever. You know, and I hope me saying that means something, because I'm like Mr. It's not a comic, you know, but really, I just hope that everybody gets to experience a good story, well told, in whatever form that best delivers it.
Thank you, Scott.
Sure.
It's so hard for me to continue on because I know that you have a lot of fans here and we could all just listen to you speak on and on about comics forever. But your response really makes me think about all the work that I've done as a TVI, a teacher of the visually impaired, that alternate media specialists do, and anybody who's been involved with making alternate media for either deafblind students or blind and low vision students, deaf and hard of hearing students. So we do have a couple people in the panel who have also done this sort of work in figuring out how to interpret comics into equitable experiences for students. So the next question I have is for the people who have actually done this sort of work in adapting comics for students. We have Daniel Fontaine, who is an alternate media specialist at San Francisco State. And we also have Darren DeFrain and Aaron Rodriguez, creators of the Vizzling app. So I don't know, would you guys want to just maybe take a minute or two to talk about the work that you have done in creating your alternate formats? And then I can pose a question to you guys. So Daniel, do you want to start us off?
Oh, sure. Hi, I'm Daniel. I'm the Accessible Media Program Coordinator at San Francisco State. I'm a white male with long hair pulled back, and I'm sitting in front of a desk with books and camera gear. So I was recently invited to the panel because we got a comic book in to a comic book request from a student who basically said they wanted us to read it to them. So we figured we couldn't hire a reader for a comic book. So this was a clear job for for a document remediation task. Being someone in the field, my first inclination was to take the standard approach of get the source document, do OCR on it, tag the document, and write image descriptions. But this turned out not to be a very good plan due to the way we were originally going to work with the PDF and keep the images in there and break it up. But the PDF itself has a number of limitations in the way it represents accessible information and how that interfaces with the way you would describe a comic in order. So, I mean, Lissa, the comic that we did is it's about 300 pages and has probably over 1,000 images. So this request being that it needed to be equitable, which means it needs to be done quickly. The student was mostly interested in the informational aspect and not necessarily the images being tactile or described, which opens up, opportunities for us to do things, in a narrative way. We didn't have a lot of time to get it done, so we hired someone out of New York to write the descriptions. And what was interesting, the format we came up with was to look at the pages as whole units rather than individual panels, right? And that allowed us to write basically scenes for each page and interweaving, allows us to interweave the narrative, the dialogue of the people speaking with the image descriptions themselves, which we figured the most important thing was to maintain like a narrative flow to create a good experience. Because with the PDF, if you take the whole screen, you break up into little boxes. You now need to build a accessible structure there, which gives you read order, and the alt tags and the text boxes are different, semantically different, and your screen reader will read them in slightly different ways, which can create a confusing juxtaposition between the alt text and the text boxes themselves, which is not necessarily the most enjoyable way to read the comic. So we decided to go with EPUB as the final output, and then combine each page into one large paragraph where each the characters could talk to each other without being broken up by going into, say, a image description, then going to someone discussing, going to dialogue, then going back to an image description, which may not necessarily work if you're stuck in this DOM, this sort of a tree structure that you get with accessibility in, say, PDF or web. It has to follow a certain, certain very logical structure. So that doesn't work well for narrative. So the end product was a nice PDF, a nice EPUB, where the page structure was maintained and everything read more like a book and less like, say, a bunch of like independent image descriptions, which for Lissa, this comic in question, leaned heavily into that subjective, describing, where you describe the place and time. So you have like panels that are similar that kind of give a feeling for being in a location. But if you had to, say, describe those each individually, you would get this sort of repetitive nature of the alt descriptions, which wasn't really necessary. So for the writer, it was important to capture the feeling of the scene and then make the the narrative flow nicely. And I think it worked out pretty well. I think listening to everyone else, it's really important to figure out what the end product needs to be, what the listener or reader really needs. And for us as accessible media professionals, this course, it was for a course for environmental justice. It wasn't for like an art course or a comic course, right? So the student really needed to get the story to be able to answer questions for the course. So that was, helps guide you with what the final output should be. And it worked out pretty well. So I think I'll write it up. I think it's a good, reasonable model for this particular use case.
Wow. It sounds like you really nailed it too, in terms of identifying the purpose of the comic and what the student needed to get out of it. So just curious, how much have you worked with adapting media for blind students? What's your experience? The comics, I mean, as being in this position, I knew that they're out there and these requests come through, but this is the first time that we've really taken it on in earnest to try to create a really good product for a student. And I think I'm excited to do it. It was a lot of fun, and figuring out these nuances that everyone else here has brought up so eloquently is, kind of coming to the same conclusion by doing the work is fun. So hopefully we'll get to do it again and improve on it. I think figuring out a consistent verbiage for scenes is nice. If you're describing panels, I originally tried to write it through as keeping each panel separate and thinking of it as shots in a movie, long shot, medium shot, close shot of these different people to kind of give you feel. But then again, that's a very visual way of looking at it, and you might not mean anything. So the narrative was the primary goal of maintaining the narrative and making sure it's an enjoyable experience we ended up with. Interesting. It sounds like with some perspective thrown in too.
Mm-hmm.
So that leads us to our final two panelists. Thank you, Daniel, for sharing that experience. I think it'll be really great to hear from Darren and Aaron and hear about your journey in the space and your design process and the app that you guys produced.
Thank you. I'm Darren DeFrain. I am a white male, seasoned in years, and I have yellow glasses and a green sweater, and I'm sitting in front of a strangely colored green wall. I am an English professor at Wichita State University, and I also direct the writing program here. And I bring that up because one of the things that has really taken off in composition programs has been multimodal text. And so one of the challenges with my graphic novels courses and then with the multimodal assignments that come along in composition is how do we help students have an equitable experience with those texts? And so I'm one of the co-developers of the Vizzling app with Aaron. I hope Aaron will jump in on this. The Vizzling app combines haptics and CBML coding and visual linguistics and audio to address mise en page and spatial concerns in comics, because that was one of our early concerns. Aaron was a student of mine in a graduate class, and his final project turned into a conversation that went on well after the semester, where we started talking about, well, how do you communicate some of these things without being prescriptive, without telling someone, okay, this is what I want you to see on the page. And so we talked about it, and we developed this app, and we're at the prototype stage, and we're going to be working with Envision here in town to get feedback from blind and visually impaired users as we progress with this. Aaron, did you want to jump in and talk a little bit more about this?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Aaron Rodriguez. Quick visual description. I am white male, bald, big glasses, have a white closet door behind me, and a bookshelf that's usually messy that I organized before this. So when we were designing this app, and I think Josh brought up a lot of the questions that it took us 3 years to figure out. And that was really that every reader needs a different reading experience. And because of that, our app has a kind of a 3-tiered approach. And so the first tier is what we call global narrative, which is kind of akin to an audiobook description. And the second level is then panel to panel mode, where as you're dragging your finger across the page, you receive an audio description of what's happening in each panel. And as you pass panel boundaries, you receive haptic feedback saying that you've crossed into sequentially the correct panel or sequentially the incorrect panel. So it allows the reader to use their finger to shuttle between different modes of exploration. And it attempts to be intuitive. And then the last mode is this free exploration mode, where anywhere you touch on the tablet, it reads the object you are touching. So the tablet becomes just a series of coordinates that we program using XML.
One of the things that we were really interested in is how we can communicate things. And if you know Scott's work or Nick's work, they often have very complicated pages that you can explain what's going on the page, but you don't necessarily get a full sense of context about how space plays a role, or sometimes crowding, or how things might not be in a top to bottom, left to right order. And those are all important things with understanding the narrative and the story that's being told.
So Darren and Aaron, there's a question in the chat. For people who are not as familiar with haptics technology, could you provide a little bit more explanation of what you mean by haptics, especially in the context of how haptics is supporting access and engagement in this comics app?
Yeah, so I guess, and this is Aaron talking, simply a simple explanation of haptics is the vibrations that your phone or device give you, to notify you that you're receiving a message or a phone call. And so when we're talking about haptics, that's how we're using it in this app. Unfortunately, different tablets and different, so iPads are starting to phase out haptics in their lower range devices. And so we're kind of trying to figure out which devices are maintaining this very important feedback mechanism. But basically it's the vibrations that you feel when your cell phone vibrates.
Thank you. Okay, so, my background in the space is as an educator. And for me, when I think about adapting materials for blind or low vision students, I think about how it could actually be done in a way to make information just more universally accessible, but also exciting for even the students who aren't blind or don't have low vision in a classroom. So a question for Dan, Aaron, and Darren, where you guys have really done a lot of work in the space of adapting comics. How do you think your accessible formats might gain significance in facilitating meaningful classroom interactions between blind and typically sighted students?
That's a really good question. One of the things that's come up from several of the panelists has been the spectrum with, that not all people that are BVI are entirely blind or have the same kinds of needs and so forth. And I think in navigating a lot of those needs, you have to find ways to consider what it is that you're looking at. And as you describe that thing to yourself, I mean, this is one of the things we do in composition and creative writing all the time, is have people reframe things and as they're struggling to improve their work. This is not quite the same parallel process, but by trying to look at an image, you'll uncover a lot of things that maybe if you were fully sighted, you didn't see on the page or in the image, and it helps you work through those things that way. Just like if you're partially visually impaired or blind, I think a lot of the things that you're searching for and looking for, you can then ask pointed questions of your peers that'll help you understand in more depth and more detail.
Thank you, Darren.
But
Daniel or Aaron, anything you guys want to add?
Somebody turn on my screen. I can't access it.
No worries. We can hear you fine though.
Yes.
Daniel.
Okay. That's probably good enough. Well, from my perspective, and my job, the most important thing is making sure that the student has what they need when they need it, and figuring out efficient ways to gain accessibility in the real world is going to be really important. So this is not necessarily the comics, but we're currently working on automating discovery of videos for captioning, and this is reducing workloads for people in our job, so for me, it's going to be working on making the workflow, the production flow efficient to get documents out as fast as possible, because we don't necessarily have a lot of time when we learn about something that's needed, and the delivery window is short. So just good workflows is what I'm hoping to get out of this as well.
Yeah. So in Scott's book, he said something that there are so many comics in print today that it would take an army of readers to study them all. And our process of making comics accessible wants to crowdsource this process of making comics accessible. And when you consider the incredible amount of born digital comics that are being published every day as webtoons, and I saw some questions in the chat about this. How can authors make what they produce accessible? In some ways, when it's born digital, that's even easier. And so one thing that I know Darren and I were hoping to do is connect with a group of people interested in writing up some kind of, or building off of John Walsh wrote the comic book markup language. And we want to edit that in some ways and kind of hand out a this is how you make comics accessible workflow. And so it will seamlessly work with the app that we're trying to create, that not only when you encode the comic, you are encoding the comic to work on this app that then makes it accessible at the same time.
Great, thank you. Okay, I think in the spirit of throwing down the gauntlet, we're about 12 minutes from the end of our roundtable discussion. And so I have a question for all of you 341 participants out there. This question is for you. Please put your responses in the chat box. And this question is also for the panelists. We're going to do a final lightning round. So 1 minute per panelist, please. And we will go in the order in which you guys were introduced or introduced yourselves during this discussion. So everybody ready? So Josh, you'll have the first lightning minute in the round. And panelists, participants, this is also for you to answer in your Q&A box. Okay, so depending on if you're a glass half full or a glass half empty person, what are the opportunities or pitfalls you might foresee in thinking through accessible comics? Josh.
Wow, I'll drink what's left, regardless of whether it's half full or half empty, so long as it's good whiskey. But the thing that I think we need to worry about is I don't think that the Marrakesh Treaty includes comics. So even if the technologies are there to support the accessibility, we're gonna run into some serious copyright issues, especially around the idea of crowdsourcing comic book descriptions. No matter how good of an idea that is, the law will get in the way. So that's a problem, and so that's a half empty answer. And then the half full answer is that I think that we're now at a point where we can actually bring probably a good bit of machine learning, not to the extraction of the metadata, but to the presentation of the metadata. So once we have all of the metadata extracted, or once we have a framework for it, then just like you interact with a screen reader, you will be able to interact with a comic book reader to find out what you need to know about what you're reading.
Thank you, Chancey.
I guess I'm mostly glass half full. I feel like we are in a golden age of audio, and a golden age of audio description, which is a little bit unrelated, but we as a community have kind of seized the right and made a communal demand for audio description for videos, and we've won it across the industry in a lot of contexts, network television and Netflix and Hulu and Amazon Prime and other on-demand services. And so we've gotten past the point where all we demand is text-only access. And I think we as a people understand that the world beyond text in media is important and serious and deserves, that we deserve to have access to it. And I think we're also on the cusp of a lot of really interesting technological changes. Haptics, I think, are still in the infancy of their usefulness, but we've got a lot more spatial audio going on right now, and tactile spatial canvases that we might be able to traverse and get audio feedback underneath a tactile layer, and the cost of embossers is finally coming down. All these things are happening, and remote visual interpretation is happening. And so while it's still challenging for any person who's blind or visually impaired on any given day to get access to the comic or the graphic novel of their choice, we have more leverage, more inertia in our favor, more technology in our favor, and more options for ad hoc discovery and description than I think we've ever had before. And if we keep leaning into all that and organizing and advocating, I think we can have a really exciting future in comics that includes people who are blind and have all levels of vision.
Thank you, Chancey. And off to you, Skye.
Yeah, so I really am a big proponent and hope that we have more legislation. I think that this stuff is really going to be important, like for people to feel like they have to do it, because I think that what I want to see the most is just access to just all the media that exists out there, talking about like in education, like getting things on time and getting things converted quickly makes education really hard to access for blind people. And so the more we can have access to different the media that exists already, the more we're going to have access to a whole host of other things. So I think this is a really important issue and definitely like a social justice issue in a lot of ways. But I'm really excited because I think that there are a lot of cool people and very cool technology that that is going to help us to gain access hopefully in the next few decades. So yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Skye. And off to Scott. Any pitfalls or opportunities that you might foresee in thinking through accessible comics?
Sure. Well, here's a very specific opportunity. The kind of comics I do, what I've been calling explanatory comics, they're very connected and very reliant on words. And actually, without any pictures at all, you could read one of my books from beginning to end and it would actually make sense. This gives us a lot of opportunities. When you have word-specific combinations with pictures, the pictures can do pretty much whatever they want. And so things will change size, the pictures will come and go. This actually creates a similar freedom for audio descriptions or audio environments or haptics or anything else. So for nonfiction, we actually have a little low-hanging fruit there, something that in some ways is easier than fiction comics where often the pictures are essential. And then just generally, I think that as we understand visual communication more thoroughly, we also understand the ways in which all of us are limited in one way or another. And understanding the limitations of all people's means of communication, our cognitive limitations, our sensory limitations, I think will help to drive home the idea that we're all in the same boat. And it's good for us to not make accommodations for what we call disability, but just to better understand all of our disabilities.
Thank you, Scott. Daniel?
Well, I'm fairly new to this subject, so I don't have anything too profound to add. But I do have one idea, which is probably off base, but I don't really know the process that goes into actually creating comics generally. But it would be nice if somehow the textual portion could be uploaded to a repository separately that we as accessible media specialists would have access to in sort of a short-term situations, so that we can just get the dialogue out and work with that immediately, and then come to the image descriptions later. But that sounds like a pretty big ask, and hopefully better technologies will come in to make that an obsolete request.
Daniel, you can add that to the wish list. Darren, anything to add?
Yeah, don't let my monotone fool you. I'm very, very excited about this. From the moment I got the email from Nick, I started finding all these threads of things going on globally that I wasn't aware of, and I just think that that's really exciting in terms of kinds of efforts, both artistically and technically, that are going on. And I just think there's a surge of this. And one of the things I see anecdotally on our campus, and I don't think our students are great, don't get me wrong, but I think they're pretty typical in a lot of ways. The younger students that are coming in are super empathetic. And when it comes to things like accessibility and understanding why that's important, how it benefits all the students in the classroom, they're with it. They're with it in ways that 5 years ago, I know, slam on the students from previous generations, but I mean, they're kind of engaged by this. And I have a lot of them asking me if they can do projects on this, just completely separate from anything I'm assigning in the class. So I feel very good about the near future with this, and I'm just so excited about the stuff that I've heard tonight, and then also the stuff that's gone on the last couple of weeks on Twitter and everything. I really, again, think Nick has really put together something that's going to be kind of powerful going forward.
Thank you, Darren. And final minute from you, Aaron, on either pitfalls or opportunities that you foresee in thinking about accessible comics.
I believe I'm going to go with a half full response. Darren and I have spoken to some publishers, including Pantheon, and they've been very open to working with people who are trying to make comic books accessible. So one of the things that we hope is we can get every, commonly taught comic at colleges and universities, K through 12, accessible by lobbying publishers. And if there's 300 people here or 400 people here tonight, I feel like we can get some grassroots organizing going and get publishers to care about this issue more than they do.
Well, thank you, Aaron. And I think that brings us to the conclusion of our roundtable discussion, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. This session has been recorded, and we will be posting the link online with captions when it is ready. If you've registered, you'll receive the link via email. I've also just chatted out the link to the YouTube channel for the visual impairments program at San Francisco State. It will also be posted on our YouTube channel, inviting all the panelists to drop in links to any resources for further study. We're also going to be collecting all the links and resources that were shared in the chat, and we will be posting the webinar with a resources document. I know that there are many, many more questions that were shared tonight that we did not get to. Hopefully these questions are just the beginning of broader, richer, and deeper conversations. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Longmore Institute of Disability, for hosting this event. And Emily, you're just a fantastic cat herder and wrangling us all together. Thank you, Nick, for inspiring us to apply for that LCA mini grant to make this all possible. And I also want to thank my Graduate College of Education for supporting my work in this project. So any final words, Nick?
Well, thank you all. That was awesome. And I'm so thankful for the panelists and all the questions that I couldn't keep up with. And I want to figure out ways we can just keep growing this and learning more and connecting you all. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
This event was made possible with funding from the College of Liberal and Creative Arts Extraordinary Ideas Grant. Event hosts: SF State Comic Studies Program, SF State Program in Visual Impairments, Longmore Institute on Disability. Thank you to SF State's Disability Programs and Resource Center for providing live ASL and captioning services. Video production by Monica Kolenai.